Hello and welcome to the first session of Interact Global, the free virtual edition of Nomensa's Interact conference. We've got a fantastic week coming up for you with 15 sessions from some of the industry's leading thinkers covering accessibility and inclusive design, research and user behavior, UX and design, innovation and creativity, leadership strategy, and pretty much everything in between. Today, however, is all about accessibility and inclusive design, and we'll explore how both individuals and organisations can design more inclusive products and services. Coming up later today at 1 PM UK time, we have a discussion on the commercial impact of accessibility with Alistair Campbell, Heather Hepburn, and Chimi Kalu. And at 3 PM UK time, we're joined by Brandy Bora of Verizon, all the way from New York, whose talk will educate designers and the accessibility community on typical ways accessibility is forgotten in the design process and provide tactical design-focused solutions. There's still time to sign up for both of those, so if you haven't done so already, head over to our Eventbrite page to sign up. Up first, though, we have Henny Swan, Director at TetraLogical, with her talk, Inclusive Design Principles. These principles were first launched at ID24 in 2017 and have helped teams put inclusion at the heart of their design process. This talk goes over how those principles came about and how they can be used alongside the WCAG guidelines and how they can be used by designers, UX professionals, developers, and product owners. Henny will also look at examples of each of the principles and how they support a diverse audience of people with permanent, temporary, situational, or changing disabilities, essentially all of us. Please do say hello to each other in the chat and join the discussion. Just make sure your chat settings are switched to panelists and attendees, and that way everyone can see your messages. Do let us know if there's any issues with the stream or anything there, and we'll try and sort that out as soon as we can. Also, if you have any questions for Henny, please do submit them using the Q&A box. I'll try and get through as many of these with Henny at the end. Finally, we're using auto-generated captions for this session. Some of these might not be 100% accurate. However, when we share the talks publicly, we will ensure that they are. So yeah, without further ado, I will hand over to you, Henny, to kick things off.
Thank you so much, Henry, and thank you, Nomensa, for having me. It's a pleasure to be kicking off the week with the inclusive design principles, and thank you everybody for tuning in. I know it's an early Monday morning start. So my name is Henny Swan and I am a director at TetraLogical. We are a boutique accessibility and inclusion consultancy based in the UK. And I wanted to talk to you today about the inclusive design principles, which, as Henry mentioned, were launched in 2017. And I wanted to touch on how the principles came about and how they can be used in your day-to-day work. I think the how is important, as they came about as a result of real live projects that we were working on and became embedded into our processes to help influence and make our designs more inclusive. And often I hear people say, yeah, you know, we've got the principles, that's great, but how can we practically apply them? Before I kind of get into the depths of it, I just want to say, you know, inclusive design, as you and I know, is about everyone, no matter what your culture, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic status, or disability. But for today, we are going to focus on disability. But as you go through this, think about this in your day-to-day work and your context and how it could apply to other areas of inclusion. So the inclusive design principles are just that. They are principles, a set of principles to help guide you when designing better, more inclusive user experiences, features, user journeys, which accommodate as broad an audience as possible, including people with disabilities. I often get asked, well, do they replace the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines? Absolutely not. They're intended to work alongside the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, otherwise known as WCAG. And WCAG handles really the core elements of accessibility within products and services. So WCAG is much more focused on the specifics of things like focus states or good semantic structure or labels for form inputs, etc. Whereas the principles are much more focused on how that all comes together to create a user journey or a feature or a page layout, etc. So it's much more of the kind of the overview. And this is why they're very important for looking at during really quite early on in a product process, sort of during requirements and design. So there were 4 of us who kind of put our heads together to come up with the principles. Ian Pouncey, who'd done a lot of work at Yahoo in the early days and had done work on BBC frameworks, so frameworks being the header and the footer, which is exceptionally important for a website of that size. And he'd also worked on the iPlayer experience. Then Hayden Pickering, who's written extensively on inclusive design, including the Inclusive Components website, which if you haven't gone and visited, go have a look. And his book, Inclusive Design Patterns. I'll tweet out some links after this. And then Lonnie Watson, who'd done some work very early on with the government digital service on the redesign and relaunch. So we'd all been looking in our own sort of respective ways about how to make products and services more enjoyable for people with disabilities. So who are they for? Well, they're for everybody. They are about putting people first. They're not about technology and standards and compliance first. It's about putting people first. So again, we have WCAG and accessibility as our foundation, and the principles are about bringing people with disabilities to the heart of the design process. So thinking less about compliance and more about experience. I think this is important because people are unlikely to say, or disabled people are unlikely to say, hey, I want WCAG 2.1 level A, I want lots of way ARIA, etc., etc. People are more likely to say, I want a choice. I want to be in control of how I interact with this website or application. And I want features that work for me and bring value. And I want the same experience as everybody else. I don't want an accessible alternative. We did think about having people first as a principle, but we realized fairly quickly that this was kind of underpinning each of them, each of the principles, that is. So who can use them? Well, again, everyone can. I'd recommend reading them, thinking about them in the context of your role and how they might apply to you. They're there for cross-disciplinary teams to use regardless. So I think they're useful if you're a product owner, if you're a business analyst, user researcher, user experience designer, visual designer, content designer, or developer. They can really be applied across the board. So we have 7 principles, which I'll read out and then we'll go through each of them in a bit. So we have provide a comparable experience, consider situation, be consistent, give control, offer choice, prioritize content, and add value. So I mentioned at the start that some of the principles came about as a direct result of working on real projects. For me, one of these was early designs for the BBC Media Player. The BBC Media Player was a single player to replace 40 odd players that the BBC had at the time to bring in sort of one universal experience. And we needed to make it accessible for all of our disabled users. Now, as a team, we understood how to make it accessible. We had WCAG, the Web Content Guidelines, accessibility guidelines for that. But what we really wanted to frame and understand better was how to give people with disabilities an experience that they wanted and that added value for them. And that was quite a different thing. Media player accessibility is so much more than just adding text descriptions to buttons, having clearly understandable icons and good keyboard support. So as a team, what we did was started to ask ourselves questions like, what do people want? We started to look at the features that we were planning. We've got 5 features that we want to implement, but perhaps as part of our process of deciding what to do next, we should ask ourselves what's going to positively impact our disabled audience. And then we kind of asked ourselves, well, how can people get to the player and how can they find the formats that they might want, be it subtitles, audio description, or sign language? So we started to ask ourselves these questions kind of before we were designing new features and plugins. So we'll look at the principles from the point of view of different activities and roles in the project team. So at the beginning of any project, we have requirements. They in turn drive the design brief, which in turn drives coding and QA and everything that follows. So for this, we have our first principle, which is consider situation. People use your interface in different situations. Make sure your interface delivers a valuable experience to people regardless of their circumstances. So this is less about the actual kind of final output and design and much more about who your disabled audience is and what they are doing. People aren't just disabled. We are all using your product for different reasons and within different contexts. So when gathering requirements, you need to be thinking about what those contexts are and what people might want within those contexts. So to give a few situations here, we have a lady who's got a broken arm on her dominant arm. So literally overnight, she's finding herself having to rely on using a non-dominant hand to use a keyboard, which she might not be familiar with. Perhaps your product isn't focused specifically at children, but it might be used by young adults who may be studying and researching. And you might have somebody who's a Braille display user, who's blind and uses a Braille display in conjunction with a screen reader. Or maybe we have people using our products who are much more visual and prefer a more visual medium to understand content. Like this artist we have who has Down syndrome, who might be looking up information when painting. Or perhaps you have a website or app that tends to get used when people are out and about. So we have a lady exercising in her wheelchair who might be using a sports tracking app or a music app. But perhaps with her situation, she might be someone who normally wears reading glasses when at home, but she's not going to be wearing reading glasses when she's out using her wheelchair. So different situations. Babylon Health design system, Babylon Health DNA, as it's known, captures how to consider situation for people really quite well by asking 3 simple questions. How does my audience, the user, feel right now? What does my audience, the user, need to know? And what is the designed outcome? I think if you insert disabled audience, you have a pretty good method for considering different situations. Rise is a domestic abuse charity in Brighton, in the UK, where I happen to live actually. And they do what many charities of similar to them do, which is consider the situation of people who are using their website who might be under enormous pressure, who might be stressed or who might be anxious. And they provide a quick close button that runs the length of the top of the web page. The button is visually prominent. It's the first item in the content order. It's clearly labeled. It's there for somebody who might be stressed or have cognition or learning difficulties. It's there if you're using screen magnification or if you're using a screen reader. What they do there is they consider the situation of their users. I think, mental health is something that we are talking a little bit more about in terms of web design, although probably not enough. David Swallow has written 2 really quite brilliant blog posts on a web of anxiety for people with anxiety and panic disorders, which are worth looking up, and I will tweet the links afterwards. Not many organisations take anxiety into consideration within the design process, which is obviously something we need to fix. The Home Office has a useful resource as well, together with other resources, designing for anxiety, and it has other resources for designing for people with dyslexia, low vision, hearing loss, etc. But that brings us to our next principle, offer choice. Consider providing different ways for people to complete tasks, especially those that are complex or non-standard. And I very much think of user research when I think of choice, because that's what we're doing. A good user experience is not one where we dictate how people should use the product. It's one where we've researched and understood how people would like to use the product, and we've give people the choice quite early on to influence the design. Choice is important because while we can make a feature or a component or a page accessible, it still might not be usable for some people with disabilities. And I think subtitles are a very good example of this. So we did some research at BBC because we were implementing iPlayer with a more panel with more content at the bottom that you could open up to the bottom of the screen. Now, if you're using subtitles, then where do the subtitles go? Do they become obscured by that more content? Do they move to the top? Do they move to the middle? So we decided to ask some users what their preference and their choice was. So we had two questions. If you had a choice, what size would the subtitles be? And if you had a choice, where would you position subtitles when the player controls and other content appears at the bottom of the screen? We invited people who were deaf, hard of hearing, using English as a second language, people who were autistic, to come and comment on what they found. So the net result is we have the iPlayer, where typically subtitles sit at the bottom, and then once content is opened, so you've got the player controls open at the bottom, and then above that you've got the next episode showing, the subtitles are pushed to the top of the screen. And that was the overwhelming preference of people that we asked that it go to. Now, we had a hunch that would be the case, but we did not want to assume that we understood what people might want. Which takes us to our next principle: add value. Consider the value of features and how they improve the experience for different users. And here I think about user experience design. How can we make user journeys easy for people with disabilities to use? Often it is about designing a path and seeing where you can add value. So we can have a path where people can get from A to B. We know we can make it accessible, but how can we make it a little bit easier for everybody? Something that we see everywhere at the moment is how you can make passwords easier to understand. So if you think about text input for passwords, it's incredibly difficult. You need to have a good memory to know what your password is. You have to have good recall. You need to have good dexterity to input it. And this is, many people have password keepers and save stuff in the browser Chrome, but this isn't always possible for a lot of people. So just including a show hide password button is a very simple but effective way to enable people to check their work or to check their password, because often rectifying errors takes longer than we would hope. Our devices, our mobile devices, are an extension of both the websites and applications that we use, but also they're an extension of ourselves. They help us hack the world around us. So features such as iris scanning, voice and facial recognition, finger pattern authentication are all available in various different mobile phones, and they're an excellent way of adding value, as they can help people complete tasks otherwise bound to those tricky keyboard inputs. This is explained quite beautifully by a gentleman who was trying out an app called My Perry Mobile, which has a voice assistant in it. And he says, this app allows me to be more independent and frees up my parents from having to check on these things for me. So here he is outside, not at home, in his wheelchair, where he has his his mobile phone attached to the front of his chair. Now, it means that he can just quickly use his voice to do whatever he needs to do. He doesn't have to call his parents over or get help, and it means he can do things privately as well. But remember that by their very nature, biometrics are also exclusionary. So we can't be offering just fingerprint recognition or just facial recognition, because if I have a broken arm, I can't use touch. I can't use it if I'm paralyzed or if I'm holding a bag of shopping. I can't use voice if I'm non-verbal or if I'm deaf or if I've got a cough. I can't use facial recognition if I'm unable to move the phone towards my face or my face towards the phone, or if I'm driving a car. So you must always design these experiences together with our, very kind of standard, familiar, known input methods, which is using the keyboard as well, in an accessible way. Which brings us to our next principle, which is give control. Ensure people are in control people should be able to access and interact with their content in their preferred way. So I think of this as visual design, and as visual designers, you have a really key job. Control is as much about not taking control away as it is giving control. That's how I think of it anyway. You have the power to both enable and disable people with your design choices. If you think about the gentleman in the wheelchair who's got his phone fixed to the front of his wheelchair, if you as a designer intend for the orientation to be fixed, then he can't use your website or application because he can't reach out and change the orientation of his actual physical device. So yes, push and innovate and design the next best thing. That is the way we advance the modern web, of course, but don't make decisions for people about how they input to your or interact with your content. Netflix is a common example of using auto-playing clips from shows. It's a core business requirement for them, and I get it and I understand it, and I think that's totally fine. And what they do, which is really good, is they have a button where you could switch the sound on and off, which again is great because it means as a screen reader user, I'm able to hear my screen reader, which otherwise I might not if it gets drowned out by the sound. But perhaps what would be even better is if they had a button where you could just stop the movement as well, because as a sighted user who might have vestibular disorders or become very disorientated with movement, when you mouse over things and they start to open up and collapse, it can be very disorientating. Control can come in the form of very simple things like layouts. So Dropbox does a really good implementation of different types of layout online. So you can have grid, you can have list, but you also have options for large grid or large list. This is fantastic because I've seen in usability testing, one of our participants really struggled with scrolling. They were autistic, if I remember rightly, and they really struggled with scrolling. So actually they wanted a small list to get as much on screen as possible. And then there are other people who might want a larger touch target or might want the visible image to tap on or to select. Another one with control is mega menus. We spend so much time, don't we, making them accessible, but actually the usability of them is really something else. They're hard. James Williamson, who has ALS, wrote a very good blog post, and in it he talked about mega menus, and he said, when creating drop-down menus or complex menu interactions, carefully consider the amount of distance you are asking the user to travel and the hit target required by the menu, allowing any drop-down content to remain visible until focus has been moved away from the menu creates a much more accessible navigation pattern. This recording shows him mousing over festival info link, and along the sort of the bottom on a horizontal line, there are a number of different other links, and he's trying to move along the bottom of the horizontal line, and it's so narrow, it's really difficult for him to tap on. And actually, as someone who doesn't have dexterity issues, I know that that's a pretty tough interaction for me. So just increasing the amount of space available would be one way of fixing that. Next, we have be consistent. Use familiar conventions and apply them consistently. And this goes to interaction design. Give users what they know, whether it's your pattern library or standard design patterns. Consistency for me can be both internal and external consistency. If we look at external consistency, let's think about Our Lady with the broken arm, who her situation is she's broken her arm overnight. She's not familiar with using a keyboard. The first thing she will do is probably go and search how to navigate web pages using a keyboard. The information that she finds will be standard keyboard commands. So that will be what she starts to try and use. So if your content doesn't work consistently with standard keyboard commands, then she's immediately put at yet another disadvantage. She's already, her productivity and probably her confidence are already a little bit dented. So not making your content consistent with what the expectation is problematic. Internal consistency is about making sure your visual design, content design, and your screen reader user experience is all consistent. We commissioned a text description and labeling audit actually from Nomensa at BBC of various parts of the site where we were using icons and labels for screen readers because we wanted to see how consistent we were. And what we found was to take the media player experience again is we had numerous different visual icons for full screen, which is confusing for people. You're looking at the same product, BBC, or not rather the same product, same organization, but multiple different products of different visual treatment of the full screen button. And unfortunately, this also was replicated for the screen reader user experience. Some said enter full screen, some said full screen graphics, others said full screen app button. So it was all different. So for somebody who uses a screen reader or braille display, that becomes problematic. Then we have prioritize content. Help users focus on core tasks, features, and information by prioritizing them within the content and layout. And this comes to content design. So visual structure is very important for making sense of information on a page. Visually, this can be done by, an element size. If it's big, it draws your attention. It might be a heading. It's important by use of color, shapes and behaviors such as hover states to identify links, layouts. We expect, search, for example, to be in the main navigation. Good visual structure helps people identify which elements of the page are important and helps people to quickly, accurately and definitively understand or decide where they need to go next. This helps people on the autistic spectrum or with other cognitive conditions who might have different approaches to executive functioning. So that means, people deal with getting things in the right order or process information in a slightly different way. And that impacts how they plan and where they go next. So in other words, it's, impacting how they understand priority content. So Mind UK is a mental health charity, and their homepage is a great example of prioritizing content and minimizing kind of unnecessary content as well and making things clear. Other than the logo, in the header, there's 2 call to actions, which are very clear. Get help now, make a donation. That's essentially what Mind does, gives help and needs to raise funds. The main navigation is a set of clear links, no tricky mega menus or flyout menus, really crisp contrast, and the get help now it's sort of reiterated in different forms on the page. So visually it prioritizes content. But we need to think about how we can do this prioritization for screen reader users as well. And actually, I think, again, Mind does a great job. You get the 2 key call to actions are there in the header, get help now, make a donation. So it's high up in the content order. If you cannot see the screen, it's right there high up on the page if you use screen magnification. So again, it's prioritizing everything. Another way you can think about making things more prioritized when you can't see a screen is heading structure. Key editorial after the H1 section headings are great. So I've got the gov.uk claim a tax refund page, which is a page within the money and tax section. They have an H1 at the top of the page. They have the main content, the paragraph lists, a start now button, which is very clear, and then another heading for related content. So that page is really, really clear. They make it even clearer for somebody who is blind by making sure that the heading structure is correct. So H1 for the claim a tax refund, the main heading, H2 for related content. The main landmark region also signposts where the main section is, so screen readers can get there quickly. It starts with the main heading. We then have content that is broken down into a list. So we have lists for the breadcrumb. We have a list after a short intro paragraph, the main content, which just makes it far more easier to read. We then have the breadcrumb, which is in a list. And this is great because this helps people understand where they are where the page sits within the whole architecture of the site. So people know where they've come from, and if they need to go back, they know how to go back as well. They also do a great job of prioritizing everything by clear link text. So links to the page are claim a tax refund, which is also the heading for the page. The page title is claim a tax refund, and the URL is claim a tax refund. And as I say, the H1 is. So there you're left in absolutely no doubt as to where you are and what the priority content is here. Somewhat in contrast to somebody who might be using screen magnification on a TV website. So I've got a short video and I've got the screen magnified to really a credit card size amount of the screen. So as a screen magnification user, I can see a little bit of the header, and I start to scroll down the page, as I say, magnified. And I scroll down and I start to see a program that I want to watch, Breaking the Law, Bent Coppers. So I select that and I go onto the page. I can see a page is loaded and I can see there's a box and a heading with Breaking the Law, Bent Coppers, and the box underneath where I assume the video is going to be. And then suddenly a banner ad at the top pops down and takes over almost all of the screen. I see it's a video and I'm thinking, well, is that the right video playing and is it auto playing? But actually it's a banner ad of a dinosaur skeleton with Lincoln in, of course. So you can see how you can really get lost very, very quickly. Our next one is comparable experience. Ensure your interface provides a comparable experience for all, so people can accomplish tasks in a way that suits their needs without undermining the quality of content. So this makes me think of editorial. And really the keywords here are comparable and quality. So Leonie Watson wrote a while ago now, in 2011, a really good blog post on text descriptions and emotion-rich images. Now, if you think about the experience from somebody who's blind and using a screen reader, text descriptions are primary content. And we prefer to say text descriptions as opposed to alt text because we shouldn't think of them as alternative. They're primary content. And Leonie talks about how there are, we have decorative images and we have images that convey meaning and functional images, but there's actually emotion-rich images which sit somewhere between decorative and editorial. An example of which is the Inclusive Design Principles logo, which is on the Inclusive Design Principles page. And when we were putting the page together, we thought, you know what, we kind of need something on there to lift it up a little bit. There's a lot of text on there. Let's break it up and give it a little bit of look and feel and give it some personality. And then we decided to not consider this image decorative because we were putting that image on the page to inject a bit of personality. Why wouldn't we convey that to someone who can't see the screen? So we gave it a text description of 3 hot air balloons hanging together in a calm, sunny sky. It's not editorial that sort of adds value as such, but it gives you a bit of a sense of the personality of the site. And as Leonie herself said, I used to have sight, so I appreciate decorative text on some emotion-rich images. And actually, we did ask through the TetraLogical Twitter account the other day, what people's preferences were, and quite a few said, well, wouldn't mind having text descriptions because then they know whether they want to download them and perhaps use them in different content. Maps are, for a comparable experience, maps are the ultimate in complex images, where complex images are the ones that we really kind of have to be thinking about more, or I think challenges our teams more, definitely. A map is as complex as it can get, but if you think about it, it's a visualization, it's a data visualization. The data exists somewhere in a text-based format. So all we need to do is take that data and present it in a different way. So on maps, if you go on to, this is a Google map, I'm looking up directions and it gives me options for directions for traveling by car, public transport, foot, bicycle, airplane. and then if, I'm selecting public transport, it gives me lots of different options of different types of route that I could take if I so wish. So it gets to the point where you start looking at the map and going, well, that's almost secondary information to the primary information, which is or should be accessible to everybody on the left-hand side. So in one fell swoop, you're providing a comparable experience, you're providing choice, you're adding value, you're doing all the things that we want to be doing for everybody. So that brings me to the end. Thank you. And I'm going to open the text box and see if there are any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Henny. Yeah, so much useful information in there. Yeah, I hope everyone watching found that as useful as we did here at Nomensa. If you have any questions for Henny, yeah, please do submit them using the Q&A function. Henny, one thing that really stuck with me was the line. I think you said you have the ability to enable or disable people with your design decisions. What advice would you give for kind of, say, more visual designers, or kind of where would be the best place for them to kind of look for kind of further information into kind of accessible design?
It kind of depends at what stage you're at, but I think interestingly, I was asked this the other week, and I think if you are starting out and you want kind of a really good jump off point, I would start with the W3C, the way and the way Web Accessibility Initiative. They've got tutorials. There is also a free course that they've put together, which covers everything. So kind of who are our disabled audiences? How do they approach, content? How can you design better experiences? And also how can you code better experiences? I think that's a great place to start if you're relatively new to this. After that, it's really a case of, I would say, sort of figuring out who the good people are to follow on Twitter and ask them questions, etc. as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Cool. Henny, we've got a question here from Sonia. You mentioned a point about mega menus and accessibility. Are you able to remind them of the name of the person that had written the blog on that?
Yeah, it's James Williamson. So his website is Simple Primate. He has ALS, which is locked-in syndrome. You might remember the ice bucket challenge, but he has written some really amazing blog posts, some of the best sort of writing, from somebody who understands web design, and somebody who's experiencing a disability that really, frankly, changes on a very regular basis. He wrote very generously about some of the things that he's noticed for him challenge him slightly. So yes, Simple Primate. I'll tweet out a link to that, and his name's James Williamson.
Thank you. So we've got a question here from Joseph, who says, what about layout for people who zoom in with assistive tech? Should we left align everything for using kind of the mute button on Netflix as an example?
Good question. Now we have to balance that, don't we, with what looks right, etc. I would say that I'm not qualified to answer that, and that's something that I would go and ask people. I would do some user research into it. So my gut would be that as a screen magnification user, you'd see where the actual video is, and you'd naturally probably go to the bottom and probably go from left to right. But I don't know that. I'm not a real user. So that's a really good example of where I'd take it to user research.
Awesome, thank you. So we've got a few questions in the chat actually about accessible maps. So Laura asks, she'd love to know more about accessible maps, and is asking, how do you make navigation of maps more accessible? For example, dragging, zooming, and other interaction patterns. Are there any resources out there?
Yes, dragging, let's go with that one. Years ago, Pat Lauker wrote about making Google Maps accessible, but that was a very, very long time ago. I think probably like 10 years ago. But yeah, you can make things, you can technically make drag and drop accessible. but it's never going to be fully usable for everybody, which is why I often talk about drag and drop with the principle of choice. So provide alternative, choices for complex or difficult interactions, because as somebody with poor dexterity, I might struggle to drag. I tend to find that quite fiddly anyway, some people do. So I would provide a different way of completing that task. So adding in, I think on Google Maps, you can add in coordinates. So if you go onto map and you do directions from A to B, there's a little control where you can add a stop. So that would be kind of going a little bit towards giving you an alternative way to do that. Zooming controls, you simply need to make sure that the button can be accessed with a keyboard and that it's technically coded in a way that makes it accessible, so you can zoom up and you can zoom down.
Thank you. So there's another maps question here from Hannah, who's asking if there's any guidance about how these are embedded, and is kind of Google Maps the best solution, or is there another service that you'd recommend maybe? Yeah, and if there's any guidance around kind of sizing, etc.
There may well be, but I haven't done enough digging around in maps to know, and I haven't done a comparison of different maps out there to kind of know really which ones are more accessible. That I'm sure there'll be some resources online to help with that, and one way to go around it, just to check yourself, would be to tab around it to see if there's visible focus states, to run a screen reader over it if that's at all possible. But I think Google Maps is relatively accessible.
Thank you. So we have a question here from Federica, who asks, how do you make your usability tests more inclusive and representative of users with different needs? And how do you lead them?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I love that you're thinking about including people with disabilities. There's a few different things you want to be thinking about. So number one, obviously you're going through recruitment and saying, let's say you've got found some people that you want to invite to participate in your user research. You need to make sure that all the materials that you share with them are accessible, and by that I mean invitations, if there's instructions, documentation that you might send out in Word, that all that documentation is accessible. If you are doing remote user research, you need to make sure you're using a platform that people use. We use Zoom. We find that to be quite accessible. If you're working with people who use a screen reader, you need to make sure that they're comfortable with their setup, with getting everything so it can work through Zoom. So we have a whole bunch of instructions for people who use iOS and Android, etc. When it comes to the testing itself, actually I should talk about in-person research as well. It's just making sure that people have what they need to support them physically getting to wherever you're doing the testing, that the space you're testing in is accessible, so it can accommodate wheelchairs. There's no steps without lifts. There's wires which are tucked out the way. There's somewhere for guide dogs to go if they need to go outside, that kind of thing. When it comes to the user research itself, we always schedule a little bit of additional time so that people can settle in. We can just make sure everybody's setup is working well and they're comfortable and they're not stressed. And we always make it very, very clear that obviously this is not a test of them, but it's of the product. And we make sure that the product that we're testing is accessible, because of course you do not want to be taking a product with no accessibility or even some broken accessibility to usability testing, because that's what you end up testing, is broken headings or missing text description, which is a waste of time. You want to be testing the experience once the product is accessible. So there's a few different things to consider there.
Thanks, Henny. So we've got a couple of questions about kind of plugins and browser extensions, things like that. So Claire's got a question. I keep seeing accessibility plugins on sites, even some quite big commerce websites. Are these a good quick fix? And has any testing been done to validate their effectiveness for people with disabilities?
They're not really a good fix. People who people who access content in a specific way on a day-to-day basis will have their setup, they'll have their adaptive strategies, their assistive technologies such as a screen reader or voice input. They're not really those types of plugins and overlays. They don't really make a site accessible. They're not even really a quick fix, I would say. Some sites might think that it buys them a bit of time, but it's never going to solve for everybody. There's a few blog posts out there, and again, I'll dig around because there has been some testing. Some people have done some stuff. I think the Paciello group might have a blog post on that, if I recall correctly.
Thank you. So we've got a question here on asking, how can a news platform find the right balance between user experience and pop-up ads, which are financially driven? So I'm guessing kind of around the accessibility of pop-up ads, which you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the pop-up ads are not bad. You know, advertising is there for everybody for a reason. I think we all, you know, go and have a look at the Daily Mail, for example, and sorry, Daily Mail, that's how not to do it. It's too much, it's too evasive, it obscures content. It's, you know, the site is very deliberately like that, though, I would say. But then you could go to, I mean, I look at sort of, you know, if you've got VPN, look at BBC worldwide, and it's more discreet. So the adverts are there, but there's less movement. It doesn't overlay. It doesn't jump out at you like the one we saw with the dinosaur video that auto-played as soon as you hovered over it. That's not a great experience, and that's going to prevent people accessing content. So it's finding that balance. It's like, yes, you do need to have it. It's a business requirement, like with Netflix. But it's finding that balance to give people control over what they have and not to take, you know, force an experience on them.
Thank you. So we've just got a couple of questions left here. First one from Alex. He says, thanks for all the great examples of self-service websites and apps, but do you have any stories or examples where the principles have been used for employee-facing user interfaces?
Oh, no, because we don't normally get access to them. But yeah, I think same rules apply. But no, I don't have any examples that I can give you off the top of my head, I'm afraid. But, you know, it's just making sure that, because intranets can be quite tricky, can't they? Sometimes making sure that, again, the principle around priority would be quite key, I think, for that one.
Cool. So yeah, we've got one more question here from Michael, who asks, have you seen any good accessible examples of inherently visual tasks, such as taking a selfie for people with visual impairments?
Yeah, I think really you want to be looking at iOS when you've got, so iOS comes with a screen reader called VoiceOver, that's built in. And when you're taking a selfie, it can tell you to move closer or move further away, or whether you were in the frame or not. This kind of logic is also pulled over or can be pulled over. So if you're introducing facial recognition to your app, you can make sure that that's done, that you've got that all leveraged appropriately. So that's a way of adding value. And so it basically just tells you where to put your face and to go in and further away, etc. So yeah, iOS is a good example there.
Awesome, thank you. Oh, we've just had one more question come in, which will be our final question from Joseph. And Joseph asks, is there a good design system you would recommend? Some seem to make a lot of assumptions.
Yes, and I think also you have to remember that a design system is specific to an organization. So as opposed to when you have a set of guidelines which have to be kind of sort of statementy, design systems are quite specific to this is how we do it. So you have to be very aware of that, because it might not be appropriate for your situation and your context for your website. I tend to look at a lot of different ones. I see good in quite a few, but maybe they wouldn't work for some of the things that I'm looking at. But, you know, Adobe Spectrum is interesting, Bulb is interesting. Yeah, they're two that I've been looking at more at the moment, and we're actually kind of looking at building out one of our own as well that we'd share which help explain components, etc. So watch that space.
Thank you, Henny. Yeah, that was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you to everyone that's tuned in as well. Everyone that's watched and everyone's asked questions and kind of joined the discussion too. Up next, we have a discussion on the commercial impact of accessibility with our Director of Accessibility here at Nomensa, Alistair Campbell, Chimmy Kalu of Triptease, and Heather Hepburn of Skyscanner. That's at 1 p.m. UK time, and there is still time to sign up. So head over to Eventbrite if you haven't done so already. Finally, we are hiring here at Nomensa. So if you're a principal or junior accessibility consultant looking for a new challenge, please do get in touch. We've also got many more roles open across account management, UX development, and in our studio too. So yeah, head over to nomensa.com/careers for more info on that. Henny, again, thank you so much for your great presentation. And yeah, hopefully we'll see everyone back at 1 p.m. for the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions.
Cheers. Bye-bye.